Everyone, my name is Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ and I'd like to welcome you to today's user share with the networking SIG. Going to be talking about delivering and optimizing Citrix from Microsoft Azure, popular topic here lately. Just briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with CUGC or haven't been to the site recently, want to let you all know that we have over 16,000 members across the globe, with 60 local user groups and some special interest groups like the networking SIG. We'd love to have you come back by the site at mycugc.org and check out all of the information we have out there, lots of forum discussions, blog posts, and find your local user group and get involved. Just a couple of housekeeping details for you today. We are having a presentation about 90 minutes, more or less, with some Q&A at the end. We'd love to have you type your questions into the question area in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll keep an eye on those.
Sorry to jump in, we've got a couple of people saying the screen is blank.
The screen is blank. Let's see here. It says I'm sharing it. So I will, I don't know, but I'll switch over to you guys in just a sec. I'll get through the rest of this. Yep. The presentation is also being recorded and will be posted on mycugc.org shortly afterwards, either probably sometime tomorrow, and you'll get a link to that recording as well. And with that, I will hand things over to Marius, Sandbu, and Dave Brett, who will get us started with the webinar.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm just going to share my screen or share my presentation. So,
yeah, I can see that, Marius. That's cool.
For some reason, there we go. Everything in full screen now?
Yes.
Yes, good. Yes, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about, as Stephanie mentioned, Citrix in Microsoft Azure. So we have a bunch of different stuff we want to talk about. We can't cover everything in 90 minutes, but we'll try as best we can. We also have a competition at the end of the webinar, so you might need to stay focused on the content we're presenting, because there's a question coming at the end, and you get the chance to win some kick-ass MyCUGC t-shirts. So a little round of introductions. My name is Marius. I work for a service provider company in Norway called Evry. I usually dabble a lot with Microsoft Azure these days, so Microsoft Azure and of course Azure Stack. A lot of projects been involving the last 6 months around Citrix and Microsoft Azure especially, so a lot of interesting conversations that I've had over the last couple of months. So if you have any specific questions, as Stephanie mentioned, feel free to post them in the chat window. Dave?
Yep. Thanks, Marius. So my name is Dave Brett. I'm based in Liphook in the UK. I'm a Citrix CTP and a MyCUGC networking SIG leader and a community contributor on dougsdabcc.com. I can be found online at bretty.me.uk, and my Twitter handle is up there should you need to reach out to me on Twitter. Next slide. So, just gonna run through what we're going to cover today. As Marius said, there's a lot of information here. We do have a lot of slides to get through. There's a lot of links up there as well to further reading. So, if you do have any questions, as Marius said, we'll attempt to answer them during the webinar. But if we don't get round to answering your question today, we'll put a blog post up on the CUGC networking SIG with all of the questions from the webinar today, as well as answers as best we can. So what we're going to go through today, the basic building blocks and options for delivering Citrix in Azure, some design decisions and deployment options around Citrix in Azure, some automation and monitoring, going to run through compute, networking and high availability config, show some example architectures of some fairly standard use cases out in the cloud and also hybrid, run through some tips and some tuning mechanisms you can use to get more out of your Azure platform, and show some example scripts and some automation. Next slide. So starting out, we're going to start with the basic building blocks in Azure. This is kind of what you need to know just to get going in Azure. We start with Resource Manager. So Azure Resource Manager is a provisioning layer used by Azure to deploy resources into different different regions using different resource providers. We're going to dive into what Resource Manager is in a little more detail further on in the presentation. Resource groups, another fundamental part of Azure. It allows for logical grouping of objects in Azure. This could include virtual machines, network cards, storage, load balancers. You group everything together in a resource group, and it provides easy way of providing access to those resource groups, lifecycle management, and also cost control surrounding the resource group. And finally, Azure Active Directory. So this is Microsoft's web-based identity platform. It's used to control access to Azure resources as well as other third-party SaaS applications that your cloud infrastructure might have access to. So a couple of stats about Azure AD. It's hosted in 28 data centers around the world. Microsoft have put a lot of effort into making it highly available. Data is always dispersed in at least 2 or more regional data centers where you define your Azure AD to be. Next slide. So this is a little bit of information about where you can actually deploy Azure resources. So as it says up there's 34 regions online and 4 additional regions currently planned. Some more information around the Microsoft cloud platform and all of their data centers across the planet. They've invested more than $15 billion building out this data center infrastructure. And there's over 30 trillion data objects stored within their data centers around the globe. It says up on the screen there, it's one of the top 3 networks in the world. So I was looking around some of the stats around that, and there's more than 1.5 million network requests per second goes across the Azure data centers. And also the fiber cable alone used in the Azure data center platform could stretch from here to the moon and back 3 times. So as you can see, it's a large global data center infrastructure. Next slide. So digging a bit deeper into Azure Resource Manager, as I said earlier, it's a provisioning layer used to provision objects to different resource providers within the Azure platform. So if you look at the example on the screen up there on the right, you have a load balancer, you have 2 virtual machines with a NIC assigned to each one with an IP address on each NIC, and then some storage sitting behind those 2 virtual machines. So to provision this in ARM or Azure Resource Manager, you would spin up the VMs, and the ARM provisioning platform would talk to the storage resource provider to do the storage, the compute resource provider to actually spin up the VMs, and then the network resource provider for the load balancer and the NICs and the IP addresses. So objects that you provision using Azure Resource Manager can be grouped into resource groups, as I mentioned earlier. An example of this might be if you had a Citrix storefront resource group in your Azure platform, you could define role-based access based on Azure Active Directory to the resource group for Citrix storefront, and then you could deploy your load balancer, your VMs, and your storage into that resource group. And only the users that you want having access to those machines would be able to access that based on the resource group. You can access Azure Resource Manager via the UI, via the normal web portal, or also via REST. So REST is really useful if the SDK is not available in your chosen language. You can use REST to access it there. There's also a method of deploying using Resource Manager by delivering a JSON template. Next slide. So these JSON templates will allow the deployment of all objects into your Azure resource group. They're really good for repeatable deployments, and they're great for lifecycle management because you can define a predefined infrastructure component using a template and deploy that into a resource group. If you don't feel comfortable with writing the JSON from scratch, you can build out your resource group manually and then export that resource group to a template, parameterize it, and then use it to redeploy that. Up there on the screen is the commands you would use in PowerShell to deploy it. And you can see there the standard command pointing at the resource group with a template file and also the template parameter file. This is great because it makes your templates generic and repeatable. So you can use the same template to deliver the same resource group with multiple different VM names or load balancer names within your same subscription. And it also works in Azure Stack, as this uses ARM for provisioning.
So when it comes to planning deployment of Citrix in Azure, this is a typical conversation that I have with a lot of customers. So why should I choose Azure as my platform for delivering Citrix? And of course, there are different considerations that you need to do, especially around cost is one of the things that most customers talk to me about, is running my Citrix resources or services in Azure a lot cheaper than it would be in running a on-premises hyperconverged infrastructure. In most scenarios, it isn't. But you need to think about what kind of properties public cloud like Azure is going to provide you in terms of scalability, in terms of that you only pay for what you use. So basically just so in Azure, each virtual machine is billed for every minute you run it. So when you're not using resources, you can shut them down and then save a lot of money. But it also, Azure as a platform will also provide us with a lot of functionality, especially around hardware. So we can access like a GPU virtual machine instance. We can use it for 30 minutes and only pay for that usage instead of actually buying a server, investing in the hardware and having it in our existing data center and paying for it and not using it at all. And of course, we need to think about the responsibility model when we're actually using Azure as a platform. What is actually going to be our responsibility as IT admins when we move stuff to the cloud? And of course, from a security perspective, it's still a lot of our responsibility doing patching, antivirus, maintenance, doing management and monitoring. And of course, most of the cloud providers, they don't provide backup of your virtual machines. They do redundancy. They focus on the virtualization layer and the physical layer, but it's up to you to manage the virtual machines and everything inside of it. But many of the customer cases that I've been working on has been a lot revolving around GPU scenarios. So spinning up virtual machine instances, being able to render something and then shutting it down. A lot of customers also looking at using Azure's big data and analytics platform and then having software tools inside of the virtual machines close to the data in order to analyze it properly. And of course, we have some companies which are worldwide based and need to have like a solid infrastructure, or that you have using Azure as a disaster recovery scenario, and you want to protect your on-premises services to Azure instead. But there are some limitations in terms of infrastructure that I want to make you aware of. So let's start with GPU support. So in Azure, there's a certain instance type called the NV series, which provides us with an M60 card using GPU pass-through. So it's quite heavily spec'd in terms of CPU and memory, but it has some limits when it comes to high-end storage. So an NV series virtual machine only has support for 500 IOPS per data disk. Now Microsoft and NVIDIA actually announced a new instance series which is coming later this year or 2018, which will then fix this with higher and faster storage. You need to be aware of that you cannot specify a specific instance size, so you cannot go in and say I want this amount of CPU and this amount of memory. You have to choose from an existing set of instance types that Microsoft has. When it comes to IOPS, as I mentioned, you have two different storage flavors that you can choose from. You have standard storage, which is 500 IOPS per disk, or you can choose premium storage, which can go up to 7,500 IOPS per disk. And if we go back 1 month, the maximum size of a disk in Azure could be up to 1 terabyte. And the disk format still is only supporting VHD. But they now recently announced support for up to 4 terabytes disk size instead. And since this is a public cloud platform, you don't have access to the hypervisor at all. So we don't get console access, and this also limits our provisioning options. So Citrix supports provisioning against Azure, but it's actually using the Azure Resource Manager platform or the layer to actually set up the virtual machines that you have. It also comes with a set of network limitations. Since Azure is such a large platform, and in order to overcome the limitations of traditional layer 2 networking with VLANs and so on, they use some form of network virtualization layer. And therefore, it doesn't support any layer 2 functionality that you might be used to in a traditional infrastructure or traditional data center, such as, let's say you have an HA pair, NetScaler VPXs. So when it does failover, it uses a protocol called GARP, or you want to use virtual MAC addresses or something. So this is not supported in Azure, so therefore you need to handle high availability on a NetScaler perspective with a different approach. And also when you set up a subscription against Azure, there's a default limit in terms of how many virtual machines that you can actually spin up. So there's a default quota up to 20 virtual machines per subscription, so it's a soft limit. You can basically just go and talk to support, and they can expand the quota for you. But this is basically a safeguard mechanism, so a customer doesn't go crazy and sets up hundreds of thousands of virtual machines. There's also a documented list from Microsoft in terms of what's actually supported running Microsoft workloads inside of Azure. So this is fairly up to date and documented. So it's on the address I've posted in the slide deck here. It basically lists out most of the different Microsoft software like Dynamics, Exchange, System Center, Windows Server components, and what's supported and what's not. So typical networking components like DHCP, PXE, and Direct Access is not supported running in Azure too. That's something you need to be aware of. And of course, one of the main questions I often get is that does Citrix support using different platform services in Azure, such as Azure SQL, which is a managed SQL service inside of Azure? Can I use that as my site database, for instance? And even though Azure SQL and SQL Server is quite similar in terms of functionality it provides, it's not actually supported. So when you want to use Citrix in Azure, you still need to use all the traditional components as virtual machines inside of Azure. So when it comes to provisioning against Azure, there's 2 ways we can actually do this. You can use on-premises Send Desktop, which has been supporting Azure Resource Manager now for quite some time. So it's basically, instead of just setting up a connection to your local hypervisor, you could just set up a new connector to Azure Resource Manager instead. And you can also do the same with Citrix Cloud. But Citrix Cloud also has 3 different deployment, well, call it flavors that you can use in addition. So you have the traditional apps and desktop service, which is the full Citrix Citrix Desktop experience in the cloud. You also have Desktop Essentials and XenApp Essentials, which we're going to talk about a little bit in the next upcoming slides. But you also have some optional components which you can use in addition in Citrix Cloud. So you have NetScaler and Storefront as a service. So it's basically if you want to just consume those components as a service, or if you still want to manage the virtual servers or the virtual appliances instead. So you need to be aware of if you use Storefront as a service, meaning that Storefront is actually running in Citrix Cloud, you are going to lose some functionality, such as using optimal gateway routing. You cannot do UI customization, no SAML support, which is a new addition and a late enhancement in the latest version, no multi-factor authentication directly on the Storefront, and no HTML5 based receivers. So as I said, we have 3 different flavors we can use in Citrix Cloud. We have XenApp Essentials, which is an Azure-only service. It's used to only deliver apps. And by default, when you set up XenApp Essentials, it will set up Netscaler Gateway as a service as part of the deployment. So this is using Azure Machine Creation, using Machine Creation services against Azure Resource Manager in the back. So you don't get access to Studio using XenApp Essentials as you would in a traditional Citrix Cloud deployment. So you have an HTML5 based interface where you can basically go in and specify the machine catalog, what type of workload you want to provision, and it will set up everything for you. There are some steps you need to or some prerequisites you need to configure first. I'll cover those in a later slide. But XenApp Essentials, it's a monthly subscription. When you set up XenApp Essentials from the Azure Marketplace, you will actually get billed for the Microsoft RDS license as well as the Citrix license. And it's a minimum 25 users fee, regardless if you are 12 or 20 employees. You also have Desktop Essentials, which is the opposite of XenApp. It's basically delivering Windows 10 VDI from Azure. So it's also another Azure-only service. The difference here is that Desktop Essentials requires that you have an EA subscription with Microsoft. And the limitation here is basically from Microsoft's side. And you also need to have a specific license on your Windows 10 using concurrent branch of business enterprise, and you have to have a per user mode license. Here you have some limited access to Citrix Studio, and here you have the option if you want to choose or use Netscaler Gateway as a service, or if you want to use traditional Netscaler as a virtual appliance. But XenApp and Desktop Essentials both use Smart Scale in the back, so it basically goes in and starts and stops virtual machines based upon a schedule or load. Yeah, we'll be covering a little bit more about Smart Scale and the current limitations that it has in a later slide deck or later slide. But we also, of course, have Citrix Cloud, which is the full apps and desktop offering, which delivers the full functionality of Citrix Studio. Gets updated almost twice a month, I believe. And here you can also choose if you want to use Netscaler Gateway as a service. For some reason my screen is flickering. There we go. If you want to use Netscaler Gateway as a service, or if you want to use traditional Netscaler as a virtual appliance. But there's a recent announcement that was made for Microsoft. So as I mentioned, the limitation for Windows 10 running in Azure is based upon that the customer has an EA agreement with Microsoft. But I think it was a week ago that Microsoft announced that you can actually soon be able to use Windows 10 as on VDI from a multi-tenant hosting provider or in Azure, as long as you are using Windows 10 with VDI rights. So basically means that you can run VDI on a shared multi-tenant shared infrastructure as a hosting provider or from Azure, but it requires that that you have Windows 10 from CSP, which is another reseller agreement that some partners have with Microsoft. Dave?
Yeah, so moving on to ways of accessing your Citrix infrastructure in the cloud. A couple of options we want to focus on here is Netscaler Gateway as a service. So this is a fully managed Netscaler service running in the Citrix Cloud. It's a one-click deployment, and it is literally fully managed by Citrix. There's no public IP address that you need or no certificate, and it's a switch to turn it on. There are limitations on it. It's limited to ICA and HDX proxy only. There's no storefront options that you can define around it. So, for example, app flow or optimal gateway routing, that won't be available if you're using the gateway as a service. There's also no MFA support, which is a reasonably hot topic at the moment. You need 2 connectors in your data center for high availability if you're using Netscaler Gateway as a service. And the regions, so the points of presence in Azure for Gateway as a service are up on the slide underneath the diagram there. We are going to send this slide deck out straight away after the webinar, so you'll have access to all of it. There's a lot of links and information on these slides that you'll have access to immediately. The other option is Netscaler Gateway from the Azure Marketplace. So, as it says up there, it is available from the Marketplace. It's a bring your own license model. It's as easy as searching for it, filling out a bunch of details on the blade in the Azure portal. Once it's spun up, you log on, put your own licenses on, and then the important thing, it is maintained as a regular virtual appliance. So you would manage the gateway in Azure as if you were managing your Netscaler on premises. That is the same for high availability. So you would obviously want 2 Netscalers running in your Azure subscription. Part of the decision around deployments around that is also your resource group that you're going to put them in, and also availability groups. You want both Netscalers in the same availability group so they don't get taken out by Microsoft at the same time. Otherwise, your users will not be very happy with you. The layer 2 capabilities of the Netscaler are limited, and this is because of the network architecture in Azure. It's not so much down to the Netscaler itself. It's in the same way that provisioning services isn't supported. There are certain functionality parts of the Netscaler that you won't be able to run in Azure, so it's worth checking whether everything you require is available in the cloud before deploying your Netscaler out there. And it also now supports multiple IPs. There was a webinar on this a couple of weeks ago around multiple IPs and Netscalers in Azure. Something worth noting on that is if you assign multiple IPs to the same network interface, you can do it on the same subnet within your Azure subscription. If you want multiple IPs to be present across multiple network cards on your Netscaler, you'll need more than one subnet to provision those.
So we just got a question that I wanted to answer, because someone asked, what's the CVC connector? And the CVC connector is basically, so when you set up an integration between your infrastructure and Citrix Cloud, you need to have something called the Cloud Connector, which is basically a set of software you need to install on a Windows Server from Citrix. So it's a piece of software from Citrix, and it has direct communication with Citrix Cloud at all times. And that Cloud Connector also acts as a gateway when you set up Netscaler Gateway as a service. So all the traffic is going to be proxied from receiver to Citrix Cloud, and then to the Cloud Connector VM or instance, and then to your VDI agents in the back. But we'll get back to that a little bit later when we come to the architectural slides. So I hope that answered a little bit your questions on that topic. But when it comes to identity, when you're running identity, or when you need to set up something in Azure, you have different identity flavors which we can use. You have Azure AD, you have Azure AD as a service, you have Active Directory running traditional virtual machines. But the default option is having Azure Active Directory as a set of virtual machines running in Azure, have it in the same availability group as they mentioned for high availability purposes, but we'll try to explain a little bit more what it does. But as Dave also mentioned initially, you have also Azure Active Directory, which is the authentication layer around around Azure as well. A typical deployment scenario when you're using Office 365 is to have something called Azure AD Connect, which basically synchronizes your on-premises users to Azure AD, which then can be used by Office 365. And what most companies also do is set up federation. So you have Azure AD Connect, you have 2 ADFS servers, you have load balance those, you have 2 web application proxy servers, you load balance those, and you have public IP addresses, and you have a certificate in place. And from there on, you can provide single sign-on for your end users directly to Office 365. But Microsoft is now doing a lot of investment on the Azure AD component with a mechanism called pass-through authentication. So instead of having all those ADFS components, you can basically just have the Azure AD service or server running and provide a type of single sign-on mechanism directly without having ADFS. But there's one thing you need to be aware of, is that if you're running Office 365 on XenApp and you're using shared computer support licensing, if you switch to pass-through mode, the automatic activation will not function, so users will need to type in their email address every time they want to use Outlook or Word or something like that. And if you're also using Office 365, you should enable modern authentication if you have a federated setup. So this is disabled by default on Sky for Business and Exchange Online, but it can be enabled using PowerShell. And also, if anyone has looked at the Azure AD join capabilities that you now have with Windows 10, so if you have a new Windows 10 computer, you get an option to create a local account to join it to the domain or join it to Azure AD. So if you join your Windows 10 device to Azure AD, you basically have single sign-on capabilities directly to Azure Active Directory and all applications which are linked to it, like Office 365 and Dynamics and every application that's part of it. And this can actually be set up with the single sign-on mechanism directly to a Citrix infrastructure using Citrix Federated Authentication Service and a Netscaler Gateway. So I have added a link here which basically goes through the different steps in order to set up the single sign-on mechanism directly. And Azure Active Directory can also be used with Citrix Cloud, but only from a management perspective. So if you log into Citrix Cloud today, you're using Citrix's own identity service, but you can also source it from Azure AD instead. So you can basically do management from user access from Azure AD instead of Citrix Identity Service. But you need to be aware of that this is not available from an end user authentication. It's only for management purposes. We also have a third option, which is called Azure Active Directory Domain Services. It's basically AD as a service, so instead of setting up virtual machine instances and managing those, you can basically just use it as a service. So all users from here, or when you enable this service, all the users will be sourced from Azure AD. And this service will then provide us with, similar mechanisms like a traditional active domain controller like NTLM, Kerberos authentication, group policy, domain structure, and so on. But there are some limitations that you need to be aware of in Azure AD domain services compared to a traditional domain. So for instance, you don't get full domain and enterprise rights. You cannot extend the schema. You cannot do LDAP rights, but you can join a machine to the domain. You can specify group policy, but you cannot set it up in a and in a larger deployment, so you cannot expand the forest and the domain, setting up trust and so on. And you also cannot use this in a hybrid model. So let's say you have an on-premises Active Directory and you want to extend it to Azure, but that's not supported with this feature yet. Another limitation is that this has only been supported in the classic deployment mode in Azure called Azure Service Management, but that's the legacy model. But you can still use it with Azure Resource Manager, but you need to use something called the virtual network peering to link the service from the old resource to the old provisioning model to the new one. But actually last week, the product manager for Azure AD actually announced that this is now coming in preview in Azure Resource Manager. So I'm guessing that's gonna increase the adoption rate a little bit more than it has before. Dave?
So moving on to role-based access control. It's when you're provisioning stuff into your Azure subscriptions, it's incredibly important to define who can access what resources from the outset. So it's almost like before you migrate something into the cloud or before you build a new Citrix service, you need to identify the different components, including infrastructure and worker servers, and build out the resource groups for those before you actually build your virtual machines. Role-based access, there's a number of built-in roles already in the Azure platform, and you can create custom ones. This can be done via REST or PowerShell. It's far easier to build a resource group and assign your role-based access control to that resource group before you build your VMs. If you build your VMs and you're moving them all around and trying to configure your resource group post-deployment, it's going to cause you a lot more of a headache than if you invested that time up front and defined your access you wanted into your subscription prior to actually building out your VMs. As I said earlier, the custom roles can be built using PowerShell and or REST, and there's an example up there of the code you would need to actually deploy that. If you want to find out what built-in roles are available in the Azure platform, then there's a link up there, one of Marius's bit.ly links, that will take you directly to all of the available built-in roles. Next slide. So moving on to resource locks and resource policies, this is also a way of defining restricted policies and preferences to the way that you deploy things into the cloud. So looking at Azure resource locks, it's important to remember here that the most restrictive lock you place on a resource group or a resource is always going to take precedence over any other resource locks you apply. So you can apply a resource lock to a subscription, a resource group, or a resource to prevent the deletion of that resource or to make it read-only. And it's important to remember that it's inherited on scope. So if you have a resource group for your storefront servers and you apply a resource lock on that group, anything you build into that resource group later down the line will inherit the resource lock that you've applied. If you need to remove a resource lock from a resource group or a resource in particular, only the owners of the subscription or the user-defined admins can actually delete those resource locks. Next slide. Looking at resource policies, they're a way of defining a policy for convention within your resources, and you can assign these to individual resources and, again, resource groups. It's also important to remember these are also inherited by the child object. So an example could be if you had a tag that you needed to apply to everything within a resource group, say that tag was production. If you applied that to the resource group for all your production resources, then anything you build in that further down the line will inherit your production tag. Also, another good use case for this is you can prevent or enable only certain types of virtual machine being built into a resource group. So if you had a resource group for SQL, for example, for your Citrix platform in Azure, you could define that no SQL Enterprise VMs were allowed to be built within that resource group. Again, the same as with resource locks and the resource policies we were talking about earlier. There's a bunch of built-in policies that have already been defined by Microsoft, and they're available on docs.microsoft.com. We'll send the link out with the slide deck after the webinar.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the different networking basic building blocks and what type of functionality it provides in Azure. So the virtual network is basically the core component that you need to have in place in order to set up virtual machines inside of Azure. So virtual network is contained within a single region, so this can be, and for instance in Europe, it's in Ireland or in Holland. And one virtual network can have one or more subnets set up inside of a private IP range. So when you set up by default, DHCP and DNS is controlled by Azure. So every virtual machine that you set up is going to automatically provisioned IP address attached to it. This is going to be managed by Microsoft. Virtual machine can have one or more network cards attached to it, which can be either part of one or multiple. So a NIC can be part of one subnet, but you can also have virtual machines with two network cards which are attached to two different subnets. You can also have network cards attached with one or more IP addresses to it. And each virtual machine has a network security group attached to it. It's basically a virtual set of firewall rules attached to a network card. And all virtual machines, so if you go into the Azure Marketplace, you set a virtual machine, it will be given a private IP range, but it will also be given a public IP address as well. And by default, when you set up a Windows server, it's going to be automatically available using remote desktop externally on the default port on a public IP range from whatever Microsoft has available at the time. So you need to be aware of so if you go in and shut down a virtual machine and start it over again, it might have a new IP address because it's dynamic by default. So if you want to have a static IP attached to a VM, you basically need to go in and configure it. And when it comes to sizing subnets, in Azure, you have to take out 4 IP addresses for each subnet. So the first 3 IP addresses are reserved in each subnet and also the last one. And you can define DNS on per VM level or on a virtual network level. So let's say we set up a domain controller inside this virtual network on a default subnet, and it has the IP address of 10.0.0.4, and we want that to be the DNS server for all my virtual machines inside this virtual network. And then we need to go into the virtual network and basically specify that as a DNS server. And on those, and when you then set up the domain controller, you want to set up a DNS forwarder, you can basically point it to the IP address that it's added in the presentation here, because that's forwarding to the DNS service that Microsoft provides. But you also have different connectivity functionality you can use for a hybrid scenario. So you can use site-to-site VPN, so using software VPN gateways, which you can set up with any type of VPN appliance or firewall, or you're just using Windows Server with remote access installed. So Microsoft actually released new gateways or software gateways in Azure a month or so, which now can provide up to 1.25 gigabytes of throughput. If you want anything higher than above that, you need to choose or buy something called ExpressRoute, which is basically buying dedicated link directly to one or more of Azure's Microsoft's data centers. You need to be aware of that you need to change the TCP segment size to 30 and 50 in order to make it work, and you cannot have overlapping IP addresses. So in Azure, you might be using private IP ranges in your existing infrastructure, but those IP ranges cannot overlap with the ones in Azure. or basically you need to have a VPN appliance with a little bit more logic behind it to be able to do translation properly, if that's the case. And you can also set up a multi-site VPN connection from Azure, so you can have up to 30 different VPN sites connected directly with each other. You can also set up an active-active gateway scenario in Azure, so it provides redundancy directly, and you can also use BGP routing protocol to exchange routes between Azure and your on-prem infrastructure as well. Dave?
So moving on to the highly available services that are native to Microsoft Azure, there's three main options we want to cover here. The first being a load balancer. So it deals with layer 4 traffic both externally and internally. It only provides you with basic monitoring, so it's not the same as a on-premises or an Azure NetScaler ADC. It won't allow you to have advanced monitors to the back-end services. It will only provide basic health monitoring in that case. As I said earlier, it can be an internal or an external load balancer, so you can assign a public IP to the load balancer that you're running in Microsoft Azure and allow access to that from the native internet. Just be sure that you define the correct network security rules around that before you present that externally. Or it can be internal, so you can assign a static IP within one of your internal Azure subnets and use it as a load balancer for internal services. Next in the list is an application gateway. So this is a layer 7 load balancer. It effectively acts as a reverse proxy and a SSL termination point. It does provide basic routing of incoming traffic, such as round robin, and it'll also provide cookie-based session affinity to the back-end servers you've got sitting behind it. And it also provides a web application firewall, and this is claimed that it will protect against the top 10 vulnerabilities. One thing to mention on that, so if you use App Firewall on a NetScaler, you can put it into learning mode and define your own rules around what you want to block, whereas with the application gateway, because it's signature based, it's very difficult to create your own rules for your web app firewall. And lastly, you have Traffic Manager. So this works at the DNS level. It uses DNS responses to redirect the end user traffic to the back-end service. Once the DNS response has been issued to the end user, it will then connect directly to that back-end service, not via Traffic Manager. So it's got no visibility of the traffic going through it. Next slide.
So when it comes to virtual machine instances in Azure, there are some things you need to be aware of, especially around the disk layout. So when you set up a virtual machine, by default you will have 2 drives attached to it. You have a C drive, which is the operating system where it's installed, and it will also by default have a read-write cache attached to it. So this is useful because it increases the throughput of the disk. And you also have the D drive, which is temporary, only temp folders, so swap file and so on. So everything you place on the D drive will be wiped when you do a reboot, or if Microsoft does maintenance and the computer reboots. And as I also mentioned, that you have the differences between premium storage and standard storage, which is basically the amount of IOPS you get from each disk. And a virtual machine in Azure can have 1 or more data disks attached to it. So this is depending on what type of instance you choose. So this can be from 2 to 4 to 16 and so on. But this is available on the Azure documentation. And when it comes to service level agreements in Azure, so if you want to have SLA on virtual machines in Azure running standard storage, you need to have at least 2 virtual machines inside availability group. And then you have the virtual hard drives from those virtual machines stored in a storage account. This gives you 99.95% service level agreement. But you can also have single instance SLA agreements from a virtual machine as long as you're using premium disk. And since the virtual hard drives of a virtual machine is stored in a storage account, you have a limitation there, because a storage account which has different purposes and can store a lot of different files from different for different features in Azure, but it also is being used for virtual machines. It can only handle up to 40 virtual machines or 40 data drives inside the same storage account, because there's a limitation of 20,000 IOPS on a storage account. And as Dave mentioned, you need to create something called availability sets, which basically is used for high availability purposes. You need to create availability sets before you specify or create a virtual machine, because you cannot move a virtual machine to an availability set after it's been provisioned. And this is basically because of the placement rules that Microsoft has when you set up virtual machines. So let's say I have 2 domain controllers, which I set up availability set. I add those 2 domain controllers to the availability set when they are being provisioned. And what Microsoft is going to do is basically place them on 2 different racks inside the Azure data center. This is called the fault domain, and it will also specify these 2 virtual machines should be in their separate update domain, so that when Microsoft does maintenance, it knows that it won't affect both VMs at the same time. And it also knows that if a fault or if a rack goes faulty, it won't affect the service, because one of the virtual machines will still be available. And you also have a new service now, which is called Managed Disks. I'll come back to that a little bit later, how it compares with storage accounts. And in Azure, there's no way to provide shared storage. So like if you have like a traditional infrastructure, you have an iSCSI or fiber channel SAN, which you can provide storage and build up a cluster. But in Azure, you don't have that type of functionality from a storage perspective. So in that case, you can basically use something called Storage Space Direct, which is a software-defined storage solution which came in Windows Server 2016. So this can be used for building up a user profile disk area, and then you can use Windows Server failover cluster with Storage Space Direct and use the Cloud Witness to have quorum. You can also use the same mechanism to build up a SQL failover cluster with Storage Space Direct as well. And when it comes to protecting your virtual machines inside of Azure, so let's say your file servers or SQL or your Active Directory domain controllers, you can use agent-based backup solution that you might have, so like say Veeam, or you can use the built-in ones which are available for from Azure Backup. So it's basically now a UI click inside the portal which can go and enable backup directly. Now, there are some other things you need to be aware of, especially in terms of instances and when it comes to bandwidth limitations. So when you go into Azure and go in to see the different instance sizes, you will see that Microsoft will never provide information about what's the maximum bandwidth from a network perspective. They say moderate, they say high, and they say extremely high. It doesn't actually give any specifications on what kind of throughput can I expect. So let's say you set up a NetScaler VPX 3000 because you know you're going to consume you're going to process a lot of bandwidth. And therefore you need to have a virtual machine which supports up to 3000 or 3 gigabits per second, so you know you get value for the license that you have. So I just created this table which just shows the difference between some different instance types and what it actually is in terms of bandwidth. So this is basically been based upon my own testing using iPerf in Azure. Sorry, it dropped out for a second there. There we go. And also, when Microsoft is announcing new compute instances, they will also say that we got SSD drives. So this is the example with the NVIDIA instance type NV6. And it says here that it has 380 gigabytes of SSD, but that's only to the D drive, not to the C drive, and you cannot add additional data disk which has SSD-based storage as well. So you need to be aware of that. And Citrix has done a lot of testing, and they have concluded that the optimal XenApp server host in Azure is using the D2V2 instance, which is running one of the running on the latest Intel CPU architecture. And they also specify another instance type which is called DS2v2. So these two are the same instance types, but the only difference is as long as there's an S in the instance name, it means that it supports premium storage. So this performance test was done a while back. So Microsoft had also released a new instance type called the AV2 series type, which can be used as an alternative because it's a lot cheaper. But you need to be aware of that the A series does not specify that you get a certain amount of, you don't get a specific CPU architecture because it can be run on different hardware types and processors. So when it comes to the provisioning part, there are some things you need to be aware of. You need to have an active Azure subscription. You need to have an Azure Active Directory account, which then needs access to the subscription itself. So in order to actually provision or create virtual machines or set up storage in Azure, you need to have you need to use an account which has at least contributor rights on a subscription level. And then you need to have an Azure Resource Manager virtual network and preferably a subnet inside it where you can place all your virtual machine resources. And now you can also use the provisioning or machine creation services inside of Citrix or inside of Desktop to actually support hybrid use benefits. This is basically, so when you set up a virtual machine with Windows in Azure, you're actually paying for the Windows license per minute when you're using it. But when you have a certain Windows licensing, if you already have licensed Windows Server with hybrid use benefits on premises, you can basically, you don't need to pay for that running in Azure, therefore you can use the hybrid use benefit. So that's part of the wizard. And what it does is that you install a virtual machine, we golden image, you install applications, you shut it down, and then the wizard is going to take a copy of the VHD and then provision virtual machines based upon the VHD that it has. Now, since there's a limitation of IOPS on a storage account, so the provisioning wizard will automatically create a new resource or a new storage account for every 30 virtual machines that you provision. And useful tip, if you just want to upload files into Azure from your on-prem infrastructure, you can basically use Azure Files. It's a SMB tree-based file share you can upload stuff to, and which can be easily accessed from inside of Azure virtual machines as well. So you can either use the Azure based setup, so setting up a virtual machine in Azure, using for some form of automation tool. You can use Azure Resource Manager templates with the PowerShell desired state configuration to do automation of the virtual machine, shut it down, and then you should copy the VHD from the virtual machine to a specific or another container or another folder inside the storage account. And the reason for that is if you want to do rollback from Citrix Studio, you need to have the different images in place so you can do rollback. But as I mentioned, you can use Azure Resource Manager for automation, or you can use a third-party tool like Packer. And if you want to upload an on-prem VHD file, you need to install the Azure agent in it. It needs to be VHD, and then you can upload a VHD using some form of tool. So you can use PowerShell, Azure Storage Explorer, or AZ copy. So there's an example PowerShell script that you can use to just upload it to your specific storage account. So this is basically just going through the wizard of what it looks like. So when you set up a connection with the service account, you go into the machine catalog, then you go in and create a new catalog, and then you will need to pick out the VHD which contains the master image. So this I basically went into my resource group, into my storage account, and then into my container, which is VHDS, and then I specify my VHD I want to use to provision. And you will get this error message regardless if you have checked that your virtual machine is running or not. So make sure that the virtual machine, which if you haven't copied the VHD, just run it directly to a virtual machine. Make sure the virtual machine is shut down. If not, the copy job will fail. Then you go and specify what type of storage type you want to use, standard or premium, depending on type of IOPS you want. If you want to use hybrid use benefits, specify the instance types. So this is basically going to list out the different instance types that are available inside a specific region you are connecting to from Azure. And then you can also specify the network setup, specify the how many network cards and what type of subnet they should be attached to. And then you will end up with this. You have a specific resource group in Azure which contains the virtual machines and a common storage account for all the virtual machines where all the VHDs are stored. So when you go into Azure now and provision a virtual machine, it's going to be using a new mechanism called managed disks. So as I said, the limitation with storage accounts is that it doesn't scale, and you also have the reliability issue that if the storage account goes down, you might lose 40 virtual machines because the storage account basically has all the virtual hard drives in it. But in managed disks, the virtual hard drive is a separate entity, a separate component inside of Azure. So you don't have the scalability issues. So you can basically go up to 10,000 VMs, still have, and also have a lot better reliability, a lot better SLA agreements. Some of the downside is that with managed disk, it only supports local redundant storage. You have 3 copies inside the same region. It's not supported by machine creation services yet. So if you have set up a virtual machine using managed disks, you cannot find the VHD inside the wizard when you try to create a machine catalog. But the content is encrypted by default in Azure and is supported by Azure Backup if you want to have backup of the machines. But if you are running, or if you are having or using standardizing on managed disk, I have added a script on the last part which basically creates a snapshot of the managed disks, copy the VHD to another folder, and then you can run the wizard from there. So as I said, when it comes to XenApp Essentials, it was a question that came in earlier, like, do I have to think about management when I use XenApp Essentials? There are some things you need to manage on your own. So in order to set up XenApp Essentials in Azure, you need to have an active subscription, virtual network, but you also need to have an Active Directory domain controller inside the virtual machine, or inside the virtual network that you have. In order to, because when you set up XenApp Essentials, it's basically going to specify what type of, or which domain do you want these machines to join. And in order to reach the domain controller, you need to specify the DNS server on the virtual network level. So when XenApp Essentials starts setting up the cloud connectors and the VDI agents, they can find your domain based upon the DNS settings on the virtual network. So when it comes to automation monitoring, there's a bunch of different tools that we can use in order to do automation in Azure, especially on the monitoring side. We have log analytics from OMS. I'm going to cover that a little bit more in depth on the next slide. But it's basically gathering log information from different sources and analyzing information and reacting on that information that comes in. You have Azure Monitor, which basically lists out all the related activities happening in Azure. So if someone does deletes a virtual machine, creates a virtual machine, all that information is being gathered and it can easily be queried from the Azure Monitor. It will also notify you if you have planned maintenance or service issues or outages inside of Azure. You also have the basic metrics in Azure. So each virtual machine has an agent installed, which can basically give information to the UI about CPU utilization, memory utilization, and from there on you can basically do alert based upon the CPU utilization is 90%. Triggers an alert, can notify you either using webhook to Slack or Microsoft Teams, or send you an email, or it could basically trigger an action. And there's 2 different options here. It can either use Azure Logic Apps, which is a UI-based integration service using different connectors, basically. So if you want to try it, just tweet hashtag Azure, hashtag Citrix, hashtag CTP powers. This is just me playing around with Logic Apps, but it's, as you can see on the right side, it's basically just specifying different connectors. In this case, I choose Twitter. It's going to search for specific content, and based upon that, I have an action which is going to post a new tweet, gather information, and as you can see, there's a bunch of different connectors directly to the different Azure services, so Azure Active Directory, Azure Files, and so on. And you also have Azure Automation, which allows us to run PowerShell scripts, either using traditional PowerShell or traditional PowerShell desired state configuration. So it can run directly in Azure, or in a hybrid scenario where you have a Windows server running an agent which communicates with Azure Automation. They can use it to do deployment and automation on the on-premises infrastructure or any virtual infrastructure that you might have. And of course, you have different status notifications from Azure. It basically lists out the different services and availability in a specific region. And Citrix also has the status notification page where you can actually set up webhook notifications, so we can send you a message on Slack or email when something's not working. And of course, today we just done a lot of work on Octoblu.
So we were playing around with different scenarios about how you could integrate Octoblu into your Azure platform, and some of the scenarios we came up with earlier were proactive monitoring. So if you have a Netscaler Gateway running both on premises and in a number of Azure regions, you can use Octoblu to actively monitor inbound SSL connectivity to the gateway. And this gets around some of the issues around the NetScaler GSLB failover. If your internet pipe goes down, you could use Octoblu to trigger that automatically and send you an alert and let you know that it's gone on. There's also a large number of inbuilt Citrix things available in Octoblu, such as Storefront and Director. And if you're running a self-managed Citrix infrastructure in Azure, you could knit your Octoblu IoT provisioning into your Director or Storefront instances that you're running in the cloud, and use alerts and reactive data from Storefront and or Director, and execute actions based on the status of your deployment in the cloud. Marius and I were also, so as you saw earlier with the logic apps, there's a bunch of stuff around webhooks in there. We were also looking at the scheduled power down and the some of the other options around native stuff that's available currently in Azure. And one of the things with an Octoblu trigger is it has a webhook listening. So some of the actions you can execute in your Azure subscription, you could send a webhook to your Octoblu trigger and hand over the management of the alerting and reporting on those instances to Octoblu. And from there, you can do a whole host of things. We'll try and provide some example blueprints post the webinar.
There's a lot of different stuff we need to play around with. So when it comes to log analytics, I just want to do a little bit more in depth about that. So it's basically gathering different information, log information from different sources. So you can do Windows and Linux, syslogging, forwarding. It also has specific integrations, gathering information from Azure and also Office 365. It also has its own REST API, so we can upload manually information that we might have. And it's quite a useful tool because it can be used with a free tier, so which means that it has a limitation of 500 megabytes upload each day, and it only stores data for a week. But it can basically do a lot of information and reacting on all the information that's being uploaded to it. And so all information that's being gathered can be instantly searched in, so we can basically go in and see what's been going on from 2 to 4 p.m. each day on all my virtual machines or all the different machines that has the agent installed. So I can either do that, or I can basically add different intelligent packages from log analytics based upon what type of information I need. So it can be like or the security security infrastructure and security module, which basically is just start listing out, gathering information from all the security logs, and then giving me direct views and showing how many has tried to authenticate over the last 24 hours, how many has tried to authenticate with an old password, and so on. And Citrix is also moving down this path, so they have packages for OMS in Tech Preview, which can basically give a little more real-time information. But just to give an example, I've created a example scenario where I was using Log Analytics free tier with Azure Automation. So when you set up a virtual machine instance in Azure, by default, it's a public IP address which is commonly known. It has the default RDP port open, so it's quite attractive for hackers. So in the duration of 7 hours, I had about 1,500 authentication attempts on my virtual machine instance. So I decided to use Log Analytics, get all the security logs from the virtual machine, and then I would create an action. So any time I had more than 5 authentication attempts from the same IP address, it would automatically create an action or a trigger in Log Analytics to run an Azure Automation runbook to automatically update my firewall rules on the virtual machine to block that specific IP address. So there's a lot of stuff you can do. It's quite powerful. So this is another example of a new module which is called Service Map. Allows us to see specific services running inside the virtual machines and what type of processes and network connectivity and network traffic it has with other sources, other destinations, I mean. So when it comes to Citrix, as I mentioned, it's Tech Preview now. It's available from the Azure Marketplace. It needs to be provisioned directly to an existing Log Analytics workplace. So this is based upon the ComTrade SCAR management packs that it has. So in order to use this, you need to have OMS agent installed on the VDAs, and you install Citrix agent on top. So this delivers real-time information directly to Log Analytics. But this requires a specific license. You need to have software assurance or the customer success service, which is called now. Or you can use the community-based OMS agent, which is free, which has been developed by the guys at Sepago. So it also does a lot more advanced functionality, but it actually shows the advanced capabilities that you can have with Log Analytics.
So moving on to costs, one of the things that is often missed but should be considered incredibly important when you're moving workloads out to Azure. As Marius has been saying, you pay for compute by the minute. So as with a traditional on-premises Citrix deployment, you would ordinarily have a bunch of workers sitting there that are capable of handling your maximum user load for any specific silo or delivery group that you've got. If you take that same scenario and move that out to the cloud, then you're just going to pay more for having that workload on the whole time. You may as well scale that up and scale it down based on current workload that's being operated on those worker servers at any one time. So looking at Smart Scale, this is a Citrix Cloud offering. It's part of the Smart Tools. It allows for automatic scaling up and down of XenApp servers based upon a schedule or a load, as Marius said earlier. So something to remember about this, it doesn't provision new machines. It just switches them on or off, so it powers it up or down. So you can define a bunch of parameters around how many user sessions you want on a server, and if it drops below that, it will power that server off, and then it will give you a visual output of the money that you've saved based on the compute that you're not using in Azure. It's also the support for VDI desktops is currently in preview. With Smart Scale, as with any of the other Citrix Cloud products, if you are using them, you should really follow the news and updates, because Marius said earlier that releases are put into Citrix Cloud, as he said, like every other week almost, and there's always new functionality and features going into those services. So it's worth keeping an eye on the news and updates to make sure you're getting the best value out of the tools you're using. So next is Azure Advisor. This analyzes your resource configuration that you have defined within your Azure subscription, and it analyzes based on cost effectiveness and high availability. As it says up there, it's free, and you can use it using a REST API. It's updated hourly, so every hour it's going to go through your entire Azure deployment, check it for cost effectiveness, check it for high availability, and then it will give you a bunch of recommendations straight off the bat that you can then click on, and it will give you all the documentation, the information you need to implement that change into your environment. You can snooze these alerts, or you can dismiss them, but you have to snooze and then set it to remind you never. There's no actual dismiss button up there. And as I said earlier, it is free. So if you're using service in Azure, you may as well use the advisor. So this one's interesting, paying attention to updates. Using the Azure blogs or the roadmap document, it's worth always keeping an eye on what's happening in the Azure space. The reason being, and the reason we put this up here, is if a new type of VM is provisioned into Azure, so type 1 is going end of life and they'll provision type 2, what often happens is the legacy type will become promo, or the new type will be a promo type of VM, and you can redeliver your machines into the promo VM type at 30%-ish or 30% less, sorry, of the cost that it would for you to get the same compute from another VM type. So it's definitely worth just keeping an eye on what's happening in the Azure space using the updates and the Azure blogs. And finally is the Citrix Azure Cost Calculator. This is a Citrix tool. It's there to be able to predict the cost that your Azure implementation is going to cost you when delivering your Citrix environment into Azure. It supports Citrix Cloud and self-managed Citrix deployment into Azure. Something that's good about this, it allows you to define different user profiles in the cost calculator when you're putting all your details in there. So you can say whether your workers are task workers or heavy duty kind of GPU users. And another thing it will let you do is it will apply your common discounts to your EA agreement. So if you have a certain discount on your Azure subscription, or the prices you pay for resources, the cost calculator will allow you to put that in there before it generates your overall cost. So assuming you're cutting short on time, so I'm just going to go through this a little bit quickly. So when it comes to tips and tuning, when you want to deploy something in Azure, make sure that you find the closest region where users are located. So there's a free tool, free web service you can use, which is called azurespeed.com, which basically going to check the latency between your browser and all the different Azure locations. And if you can also talk to your ISP, or if you are an ISP on your own, try to see if you can connect with another networking pair to get even lower latency to a specific region or to the closest region. As I said, the different IP ranges from Azure are published directly on Microsoft downloads. If you need to have firewall rules in place in order to open up for the different IP addresses in Azure, but also be aware that all these different IP addresses, since they are published, they are quite popular for attackers or script kiddies. Make sure that you add a local user account to your virtual machine in case something breaks. Since you don't have console access, it makes it a little bit harder to troubleshoot, so make sure you have that enabled. You can also be using the DNS service in Azure to do automated deployments against your specific zone, but you still need to buy the domain from somewhere else and just point the name servers to the Azure naming servers instead. If you are setting up a traditional virtual machine, don't install any SQL-based applications like Active Directory or SQL Server on the C or D drives. Either attach additional data disks without any read or write cache, or
set up a custom virtual machine where the C drive has no read-write cache enabled. And when you're using Machine Creation Services Wizard, it's going to create a resource group automatically. Do not rename those. It's going to break the connection. And also Azure has a new service which is called metadata information. So you can basically query on each virtual machine this metadata services enables. You can basically query it as a web service and get information if you, for instance, or if there's a scheduled maintenance enabled, for instance. So this can be useful to see if that, okay, I can query this virtual machine. It has a maintenance set up ahead of time. It's going to restart the virtual machine because of the maintenance, and therefore I can use some form of automation to automatically set it in maintenance mode during that time. Not all, and also in Azure, not all services, when they are announced, it's not going to be available in all regions at the same time. So they typically use the latest generation data centers to add new services, and then they add it to the older generation data centers later on. So check it before you go ahead. Enable boot diagnostics of virtual machines. This is an additional feature you need to enable. This gives you a screenshot of the virtual machine, what's going on from a console level. You can't interact with it, but basically shows what's going on. And yesterday, actually, Citrix or Microsoft released VDI optimization tips for Windows 10. Which can be used for configuring Send Desktop Essentials. And also Citrix has their own optimization guidelines, which you can look at. And also when you set up resource groups in Azure, please have a consistent naming standard. So I typically have environment, location, role, and RG to specify it's a resource group. And when you're moving towards Azure, start to learn how to build your own ARM templates. So there's a GitHub repository here, which basically shows many of the built-in ones that Microsoft has created, which can gives you some guidelines on how to get started. So when it comes to troubleshooting, there are two things that I mostly find is the issue. It's basically that the provisioning part stops working. Make sure that the service principal or the user account you use to connect to Azure from Citrix Studio actually has access to a subscription from a subscription level. Make sure that you have sufficient quota so that you can actually allow to provision more than 20 virtual machines. If you cannot find the VHD in the wizard, that typically means that you're trying to set up a machine catalog based upon a managed disk. And the last thing is that when you have everything up and running, but for some reason you can't get the network connectivity to work, there's a new feature in Azure called Network Watcher, which can basically allows us to do source and destination packet flow checks, so we can basically see if all the firewall rules are in place or not. Only downside with this feature, it doesn't support Azure load balancer, so it doesn't get any specific information if traffic is flowing through the external or internal load balancer. So just some example architecture. This is a cloud-only scenario where everything is running in Azure. You also have Citrix Cloud. As I said, you need to have availability sets for each service which you want to have redundant. So you have availability set for storefront, for NetScaler, for the domain controllers, for the cloud connectors as well. And here we're using Citrix Smart Scale tools as part of Citrix Cloud to scale up or scale down the VDI agents based upon a schedule. We're using Azure DNS to do automated deployments of the gateway URL. We are using Azure Recovery Services to do backup of our virtual machines inside of Azure. And also we have log analytics, which can gather information, security logs, and so on. So that could be, for instance, gathering all the syslog information from NetScaler and basically giving us alerts based upon what's going on inside the NetScalers without having to invest in any other monitoring solution for that specific purpose. You also have a hybrid scenario where you have multiple zones. So you have a primary zone on premises. You have your own desktop delivery controllers there. You have a set of NetScalers. You have your own. You have the site database stored there. You have a VPN connection between your on-prem and Azure, which is then a satellite zone. And a satellite zone can have its own delivery controllers, but it's going to communicate with the on-premises site database. But the satellite zone can also have its own hypervisor connectivity, so it can communicate directly to Azure Resource Manager. But in Azure, when you want to provide NetScaler highly available, you need to have Azure Load Balancer in front. And then we can use, for instance, optimal gateway routing to point the users to the right location where they want to run their application. But you need to be aware of the maximum threshold in terms of latency between your satellite zone and your on-prem database in order to support X amount of users that you might have, and in terms of what type of bandwidth you might have between the different sites.
And looking at a multi-region self-managed Citrix deployment, this is showing just the Citrix components that you would put out there. You would have NetScaler and Unified Gateway running in both regions with multiple IP addresses. These, again, would need to be put in an availability set so that you don't lose service in any specific region. You'd have ADNS services in both regions with DNS delegated to both ADNS services. You would have individual storefront clusters, one in each region, again sitting behind either an internal load balancer using Azure or a NetScaler ADC load balancer. Same with controllers. You would have controllers in both regions for both zones, also in an availability set. So in the case of an update domain going down, you would always be able to broker your apps, and the apps and desktops would be split across both regions. And in the middle there, you would have to have a highly available SQL instance, potentially split across both regions using always on. Something worth noting on that is you would need to promote the second zone to a primary zone in the event that your primary database went down or the VPN connectivity between your regions went down.
So we're coming close to the end. I have added some more reading material for the different deployment guides, especially around XenApp and XenApp Essentials. There are some new documentation which came out yesterday. So I'm guessing Citrix knew that we had this webinar, so they just posted out a lot of content which we needed to add. And when it comes to just, if you want to try out Citrix in Azure, there's a different ways which you can do this. There's a lot of different marketplace items. So you have the Citrix XenApp trial, which basically is going to provision everything as a virtual machine inside of Azure. So NetScaler, storefront, delivery controllers, and some VDI agents. Citrix also has their own GitHub repository where they placed a lot of finished ARM templates to provision Citrix in Azure. So you can play around with those in order to learn how to build up an automated XenApp environment. There's also an auto shutdown mechanism which is available inside the UI, so you can basically go in and enable this, and it will shut down the virtual machine on a specific schedule that you might configure. And when you're done playing around, you can basically use Azure PowerShell commandlets to remove or delete every object inside a resource group, and you can then start it over again. So if you set up an Azure trial these days, you get a $200 trial that you can play around with. And I also want to promote, I'm writing a Citrix and Azure white paper, which is going to contain all the different stuff we're talking about a little bit more in depth. So if you want to help out, feel free to reach out to me after the webinar. And lastly, a little bit about the roadmap moving forward. So Citrix is going to be doing a lot of investment on improving the performance of the provisioning. It's going to be supporting Linux VDI agents quite soon in Azure. It'll also come with support for Azure Government, because that's a specific region in Azure. And it will also support managed disks and support Azure disk encryption quite soon, hopefully. So I'm just going to jump to the end because we're cutting it short. So to the competition, as I said initially, we have a little competition here. So we have 3 giveaways. So it's this awesome T-shirt from the CUGC. And the rules are quite, I'm going to ask you a question, and the first 3 people to answer correctly inside the questions pane is going to win a free T-shirt. Now, the question is as follows. Are you following on the questions, Dave?
Yeah, I'm all there. I'm ready. I'm watching.
Good. So the question is, how many times did this guy appear in the webinar, excluding the one on this slide? Any winners so far?
Yeah,
We have 1, 2, 3. Oh, we have our winners.
Yeah, they're all there.
Yeah. Okay, the correct answer was 6. So we're going to be contacting those after the webinar. So I guess that brings us to the end of the webinar. On the slide deck, I have actually added a bunch of the different scripts in order to do the provisioning, copying, setting up a service principal, and so on. And of course, I'll be sending out the slide deck and the recording on my CUGC.
Okay, you ready for me to jump back in?
Yeah.
Yep, all good.
All right, let's see if GoToWebinar is going to play nice with me now. Can you see my screen now?
No.
No?
No, still just a blank screen.
And so it says it's showing it. I'll just, Marius, if you can keep your slide up, I'll just take it back to you just so there's something there. So again, just want to thank you guys. It was a great presentation today. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Marius. It was wonderful to have you on with us today. And thanks everyone for participating. And I will be in touch with the winners of the t-shirts to get the addresses to send those to. And in the chat, you'll see a link to the networking SIG where you can go and join if you're not already a member. You can find lots more content like we had today, links to previous webinars and blog posts. And also there is a link to our very quick survey, helps us plan future webinars. And with that, I want to thank you guys again and wish everyone a great day and tell you all to look out for the recording soon. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.